Hello and welcome to In the Making, a series of conversations from North Bennett Street School where we connect with a range of new voices, fields, and perspectives. Before we get into our conversation, we want to thank the many supporters that make our programs possible, including the Massachusetts Cultural Council. Thanks for joining us, everyone. My name is Kristen Odell. I'm an MDSS staff member and host of In the Making. Today, we're joined by writer, scholar, and craftsperson Robell Awake to share and discuss his new book, A Short History of Black Craft in 10 Objects. 2 years ago, Robell shared his work with us in conversation with Dr. Tiffany Moman, who founded the Black Craftspeople Digital Archive. And so I feel a pull to introduce this book through her words, which are also in the back of this book. In Tiffany Moman's words, A Short History of Black Craft in 10 Objects is a history of how Black craftspeople made art under oppression, how they influenced architecture, how their artistic traditions still exist today, and how they both influenced and made the world that we all live in. It is both a history of our past and a history of our present moment. Welcome, Robell. So happy to have you here in person.
Thanks so much for having me.
I personally love this book, and I'm not just saying that to sell them. And because you're here, I appreciate so much how you distilled the research with sensitivity and a clear respect for the artisans. And knowing you as a craftsperson with your own material knowledge just added an extra layer of just special feeling reading all of these stories and bios.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. So let's just start this off by asking you the most basic of questions. Why did you write this book?
Yeah. Why? Well, I wrote this book because I think I wished it existed when I was starting out. And also it's sort of the opportunity kind of fell in my lap in a way. Full disclosure, I'm like a very spiritual and hokey sort of person. So I got an email from the publisher, Princeton Architectural Press, asking if I'd be interested in turning some of the research I'd been doing up until that point and kind of presenting at different places into a book. And I replied saying, if it's a short book, and they said, all right, let's do it. So that's kind of how the book happened. But over the course of like a year and a half, I just compiled stories that really were resonating with me at the time. I was very intentional in calling it a short history, which is to say one of what should be many histories of Black craft. And that it's open and that I'm not this definitive scholar. I say in the introduction, like I'm not an academic. I dropped out of college in the first semester and pursued working with my hands, which is what I was interested in. So, it's written in an accessible way because that's how I write and how I speak. And also, like, I can't stand jargon and academic texts, even though I do read them in order to get a lot of this information. That's kind of the genesis of the book.
And we are going to get to that question about who didn't make it into the book and some stories that maybe you would like to share with us that where you had to draw the line. But I want to ask, what was the most impactful piece of research, story, or artisan that you uncovered in this process, and why?
Yeah, that's hard. That's almost like asking me to pick a favorite, which I can't. I do think there's like each story kind of, there's something in each story that I feel really drawn to. Maybe initially, like the pointer story is really the one that kind of kicked things off because me and my very dear friend, Charlie Ryland, we embarked on a research grant through the Center for Craft for 2 years. And essentially, we were just kind of uncovering the story of Richard Pointer, who was a ladderback chairmaker from Central Tennessee. And he really pioneered what we think of as a modern day ladderback chair. It's the mule-eared ladderback is what it's called. And he really doesn't get credit for it. So that sort of research project really kind of started things off. And, I am interested in like all kinds of craft and artistic expressions. So I really didn't want to make this a book about Black furniture makers, which it could have been because initially, like, that's what I do. That's what I'm interested in. So But in recent years, like I draw more inspiration for what I do and the chairs I'm making from craft disciplines that are really mainly quilting is like the biggest inspiration for me. I think it's the greatest American artistic tradition there is, like full stop, not hyperbole. So I look at more quilts than I do furniture.
Let me pause there, and those in this audience, you really should go to Robell's website to really see the chairs that you're making, but I know what they look like. How can you explain how you're tying quilting into your work?
Yeah. So I do what's called green woodworking. For those in cabinet and furniture making, it's pretty different than what y'all do. But there's a lot of similarities. But yeah, essentially I start from a log and I split out the parts and process it myself and shape it using hand tools. And I really like it because it is a pre-industrial way of making furniture, and it still requires more hand tools, not just for like this romantic sense of like, oh yeah, I'm like splitting up a tree and making some furniture out of it, which is cool. It's very cool. I'm not gonna lie. But also like it just makes more sense in the construction and how the chair is made and what makes it more resilient than machining stuff. And also it's just like, I just feel like greenwood chairs are just way more vibrant than something that's been machined. I think like when I see a chair and I see like a little bit of tear out on a rung or like in like that discrete spot on a post, like that's sexy to me. Like I'm not gonna lie, like it's like I like that, it's funky. Like you can tell like a human really shaped this thing. So that's like what really drew me into greenwood chair making.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about the craftspeople that didn't make the book. How did you draw the line, and are there some who you would love to share with us now?
Yeah, I think part of drawing the line was like not making it all furniture makers, also making sure that it wasn't all men. So, yeah, sure. Part of how I drew the line between like, choosing just 10 was that I wanted to make sure it wasn't just furniture. I do furniture. That's kind of what I was interested in when I started research. And also that it wasn't all men. So that was really important to make sure it was a diverse range of stories. And because like I am legitimately more interested in quilt making and textile artists of the past, specifically Black women in the South, that I just look at more quilts than I do furniture. So it was easy for me to like, I have 2 chapters that are essentially devoted to quilt makers and 2 chapters to furniture. And then the rest of the 6 are kind of like, architecture, and some of the chapters are conceptual. Like one chapter is about the front porch, what we know of as the American front porch as being an adaptation of enslaved dwellings, and the awning really associated with shotgun homes. So it kind of came from 2. I could go off on a tangent.
Do it.
So it kind of came, yeah. So it kind of came from 2 sources. So like the earliest documented front porch is at King's Mill Plantation in Virginia, on an enslaved dwelling. And around the same time in the late 1700s, there was an influx of Haitian free people of color coming into New Orleans after the Haitian Revolution. And with them, they brought the shotgun home, which always had a front porch attached to it. And this became the most ubiquitous residential dwelling in the South. And what really kind of was drawn out of that was the front porch, which kind of just spread across the country. So, and I mean, like what's also kind of like crazy is like this research was done specifically around the front porch in the 70s by a cultural anthropologist named John Michael Blatch, as well as an archaeologist named James Dietz. So it's like out there, it's just tucked away in academic journals. And I think that's one of the frustrating things for me is like, I wanted to learn about this growing up. I wanted to know about this legacy growing up. And it's like, it's crazy that it's siloed into like, academic journals in the 70s.
Did I read in that chapter about the front porch that just its technical function was, how novel that was to,
sure,
I don't know, plantation owner or something, that was a novel idea just from a cooling aspect of being in the South.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think like some sort of outdoor awning covering type thing, whether it's like a veranda or, a portico or something like that, has always existed across the world. But what we think of as an American front porch does come from enslaved dwellings, and early colonizers, the closest thing to a front porch was a vestibule, like a mudroom kind of thing that was enclosed. Um, so and it makes sense when you think about it. It's like, here were people coming from climates that were humid, that were more used to architectural features that could, help mitigate some of the heat and keep you cool and things like that. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of obvious when if you really were to think about it.
Yeah. One chapter, it's the end chapter, it's about yard show.
Yeah.
Which is new to me. This is I'm familiar with the practice. I've just never had that. I've never knew that was the name of it.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about James Hampton's famous yard show work that is now housed in the Smithsonian. I want to ask you about that specifically and what you hope museums will seek out in terms of work like this in the future. The reason I ask is because to many, that's considered outsider art, and I wonder how long it had taken Smithsonian to discover the significance of that work.
Yeah. Which is like, drawing. And
can you explain what yard work is to
yard shows? Yeah. Does anybody know what yard shows are or has like some idea? Yeah. Is anybody from the South? Okay. Yeah. I actually, ironically, I was born in Boston, but I grew up in the South, in Atlanta, since I was 3 years old. But I just heard about yard shows maybe like 5 years ago. But essentially it's, in a lot of more rural Southern communities, essentially it's like assemblage art in people's yards. And this has been in rural Black communities for decades, centuries, and it really evolved out of Black funerary traditions. So the traditions that enslaved Africans brought and maintained during funerals, because that was one of the few places where people weren't as policed as to what they did and how they expressed themselves, whether it was out of reverence for the dead or, whatever. Enslaved people were kind of left alone to practice funerary traditions in the way they wanted to. And so much of African spirituality, which kind of in a lot of ways became syncretic and merged with Christianity, the symbology started in the funerary traditions of Black folks in the South. And then it kind of evolved into and went into people's yards. So there is a tradition of incredible assemblage art, predates any modernist assemblage art, anybody doing it in the vein of like fine art and in a gallery sort of system by decades. And it's really incredible stuff. There are artists like Thornton Dial, Joe Minter, Lonnie Holly, and James Hampton, who's not necessarily a traditional yard show artist because he was working in DC at the time. So he was a janitor at a federal building in DC. And for 14 years, he rented a garage and made this like insane work out of found objects in the 50s and 60s. And the Smithsonian has it now. It's just insane. Like, it's insane. And he also like had this crazy cuneiform like language that he created in a journal, which was like a codex for like his symbology and like what is just like, he was a savant. He was crazy. And this was discovered after he died, his garage, because the guy he was renting out to was like, somebody's got to come check this out. Like, I have no idea. This crazy dude has been doing this for like, he's been renting for me for 14 years. Like, y'all check this out. And what connects it to yard shows is that James Hampton was from a rural part of North Carolina. And the way he uses reflective materials and the way he uses recycled objects is the same way that, he would have been very familiar with how yard shows use that same symbology. And there's also kind of a tradition of just like subversive communication that is kind of a through line in a lot of Black aesthetic traditions and cultural output. It's just like the Face Jugs chapter, which also includes Dave the Potter, who was an incredible, if anybody knows Dave the Potter.
The MFA, is that the guy who was?
Well, there was Hear Me Now was a huge exhibit, started at the Met, traveled to the MFA, it kind of made the rounds. But they had a lot of his huge vessels. Like he was, like, again,
scary.
Yeah, just how large. It takes such technical skill to make a 40-gallon crock. And he was inscribing poetry in it and signing it, which is, yeah, it's really incredible. He was just,
You write in that chapter, Dave the Potter is one of the most important ceramicists in American history. And a little anecdote about him having lost a limb. You
Yeah.
just said he inscribed all of his work.
Yeah.
It's assumed he lost his limb not in an accident, but as punishment for signing his work, something heavily enforced by enslavers as a form of oppression.
Yeah. So it was like a double form of resistance because you're not supposed to be literate. It was against the law to know how to read or write. And you're also not supposed to claim authorship, for what you did. The factory owner, the person who owned the pottery factory had his name on the work. That's how it was supposed to go. That was kind of the way it is. The system was set up. So yeah, so what he was doing was incredibly daring. And the poetry he was writing too, which like his penmanship was great. So you can tell like it's something he really practiced and cherished, but also it was skillfully like, I think the poem I reference and you got to think too, like stoneware, which is what they were producing, which is very durable ceramics meant for plantation use and hard use to store water, to store food, salted meats and things like that, was going to plantations. So people on plantations were going to see these poems. And the poem I reference that was inscribed on a huge vessel said, "I wonder where is all my relations, peace to all from every nation." So I think like I could see a potentially violent white gaze seeing this and being disarmed by that second line, which is saying like, oh, look, I'm talking about like kumbaya, we are the world, like everybody hold hands, peace to all. But I think that first line where it's like, where are all my relations? To me, as somebody that is part of the diaspora, which is defined by a loss of history, a loss of homeland, resonates in a way that like you can't understand unless you're part of that history. So I think it's like, and it was going to plantations and people were going to see this, So I think it's so powerful. And he lost a limb over it. He lost a limb over doing this work, which is just an incredible story.
Right.
Yeah.
The first part of that story is about a white resident of that time wanting to start up, wasn't it in porcelain, and then realized that it wasn't really strong enough, and the knowledge that enslaved people brought to that to that area are what grew the entire industry.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it was Abner Landrum. He was from Edgefield. He was like initially a physician, but he was, there was huge kaolin deposits, which is kaolin is white clay typically used to make porcelain. And he was interested in making porcelain, but it's kind of hard and takes a long time. And the demand for more durable stoneware as the plantation system was really increasing and ramping up in the early to mid 1800s, it just became like what people wanted and what people, like what eventually. So Abner Landrum, his brothers and his, family members and relatives pretty much owned all of the pottery factories in Edgefield, and Edgefield was the premier like pottery hub,
right?
Of the
all
South.
Built on enslaved workers.
Yeah, all built on it, and really a testament to that fact is that I think at the time I cited in the book, I think there was like the population of Edgefield was 24,000 enslaved and 15,000 white.
Right. Yeah.
So.
And something that stood out to me, speaking of the face jugs, you note, or some research says white residents they were not popular at that time by white residents. They were not collectible. White residents didn't dismiss them as not of us. And my first thought about that sentiment is that, of course they weren't. Dominant cultures do not want to confront the horrors they inflict on others, and specifically don't want to see the faces of victims of their injustice. So I'm just trying to place myself in that point in time and wonder why they wouldn't be collectible at that time.
Yeah. I mean, I think part of it too is like, again, there is something really subversive about it because it was a spiritual and talismanic object that by the white power structure and people there was seen as this like, weird, primitive thing that these enslaved potters were doing during their free time, making for themselves and for their community. But given where these objects were found, like in, destinations in the Underground Railroad, under the threshold of homes, it was a spiritual vessel that somebody would kind of put objects into to animate it or to give it life. And, you know, it was a talismanic object. So it either brought some sort of good fortune or it warded off evil spirits. And that's given further credence by the fact that there was a slave ship called the Wanderer, which was an illegal slave ship. Slavery, the transatlantic slave trade was outlawed at the time, mid 1800s, when this slave ship docked into Charleston with its cargo of people from the Congo. And in the Congo, they do have this tradition of sort of, you know, spiritually animated sculptures, which are incredible things called inkisis or inkisi dolls. And they use, and what really ties the two traditions together is most of the Congolese people on the Wanderer ended up in Edgefield, and B, the use of that kaolin clay, the white clay for the teeth and the eyes of face jugs as well as inkisi dolls is very spiritually significant, because kaolin in the Congo was seen as a way to communicate with the spirit world and with ancestors. And it was used specifically as a way to see, to speak with them through these objects and through craft. So that idea of like African spirituality being reinvigorated with new folks coming in was really appealing to me, because it just shows how dynamic Black culture is. You know, ironically, I think like, you know, Black culture to dominant culture is seen as sort of a monolith. It's sort of seen as like, you know, but it's so diverse and dynamic, and just constantly gets reinvigorated by new folks from the diaspora coming in and bringing new elements. So it's more expansive, you know. It's like, which is so beautiful, I think, about just all these stories, is it shows how syncretic and expansive the artistic production is in Black culture. Yeah.
You've mentioned to me that you're in your own personal art practice, you are expanding beyond green woodworking and chairs. In your research throughout this book, is there one story that inspired you to just like grab that material and run with it from a creative, artistic, day-to-day?
That's
review?
like not Greenwood.
Yeah. It's going to take you away from the chair making.
Yeah. I think just yard shows was a big one. The past few chairs I've made, I include found objects, like I inlay them, and I've used like you know, old obsolete like computer cables that I found in my neighborhood to weave the seats of the last chair that I made. So I think like being inspired by the tradition of like recycling, you know, the refuse of late stage capitalism, which is destroying us and the planet, and to say something with it, to reanimate it in a way and take it out of its original context, which is what yard show artists do intentionally and in a very skillful, sophisticated way. I think that tradition has really inspired the past couple of chairs that I made.
So going back to, and I don't mean to keep mentioning the BCDA, but it is a wealth of information that, you know, was in some ways a mentor to your work. Is that safe to say, Dr. Moman?
Yeah.
You mentioned back then that the research, like the work done by BCDA, was foundational to your own entrance into craft. How did that research on enslaved Black craftspeople change your work, and when did that shift happen for you? Like, what were you making before you started reading Dr. Moman's work, for example?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I think for me, like, so I maybe just to like give a backstory about how I got into furniture. Most of my working life was in the trades, was construction. Dropped out of college, you know, I framed homes, I did trim work, I hung doors. I welded for 3 years, I-beams, structural welding. So I did like more trade work. And then 10 years ago, I took a class here. It was a 2-week continuing ed class that was focused on hand tools. It was like a project-based thing. But that was a big deal for me, because it's like, you know, I bartended on the weekends, I worked construction during the week. I had to save up for like 1.5 years to take this class. But I really like, you know, from that point on, I was like kind of off and like really into the hand tool thing. And I joined a makerspace, which was kind of popping up at that time in Atlanta. And without a makerspace, like it just, I don't even understand how anybody can make
Get anything done.
Yeah, it doesn't even make sense. I think there's a lot of, I honestly do think there's a lot of things that get obscured in kind of like how people are able to do it. I mean,
what do you mean? So what do you want to say?
I'm trying to like be very careful there, folks. Like in school here, hoping to have a career, after they get out. But yeah, it's hard. I mean, it's just, you just gotta.
They
I
all
mean,
know
it's-
that.
Yeah, it's almost like, I'm gonna keep it a buck with you. I'm gonna keep it 100 with you. Like, it is almost like anachronistic to pursue craft in 2025. And it makes sense because it's like, things are mass produced, and I'm not like a Luddite. I'm not going to sit here and knock people who, buy IKEA furniture. I have IKEA furniture. It has a place,
Of course.
so I think it's just like hard. Like, how do you even get established? I think when I was starting out, I was like, how are you going to afford a saw stop? How are you going to do that? You know what I mean? How are you going to afford rent for a space? How are you going to get a joiner and a planer? Like, it didn't equate, like it didn't add up. So thankfully, like makers, the makerspace thing was kind of happening
Right.
in Atlanta. So I joined one, and yeah, it was like, it was a hobby. It was like a side hustle that I made money out of for, 6 or 7 years while I still worked in construction and I still bartended. And up until the pandemic, that's what it was, and I really chose, I mean, like I took on whatever people wanted me to make, as well as like trying to choose projects that would really push the hand tool side of things,
Mhm.
which was like a gateway drug to green woodworking, which is like all hand tools.
But then what about the BCDA and learning and sort of opening your breadth of
Oh yeah.
education into Black craftspeople?
Yeah. So the BCDA, the Black Craftspeople Digital Archive, started by Dr. Tiffany Moman, incredible.
Must research. It's
Yeah.
incredible.
Has been doing research into just the lives of Black craftspeople, and they have this digital map, which it's only, I think, in the Southeast now, but of where, through census data, it's this digital map that you can find what Black craftspeople were doing and where. And they also have a really vibrant like Instagram presence where they post kind of object studies and talk about, use objects like this book as a way to tell the story of Black life in different time periods and different places in America.
Yeah.
So it was really, I think the first time I had seen or heard about Richard Pointer was through
that work.
that, as well as Andy Glenn,
Mm-hmm.
who I know has presented here, who, I've been talking with him for a few years. We just kind of connected somehow. Yeah, so
while we're talking graduates and Richard Pointer, can you briefly tell us about the project that you did with Charlie Ryland, who's here and who's a graduate of CF?
Shout out to Charlie Ryland. Yeah, Charlie, it was, I mean, it was just like such a transformative experience, and like definitely developed just like a lifelong friendship. And yeah, it was, so yeah, we researched Pointer, and we really wanted to understand like his significance in chair making, in green woodworking. And we had intentions of like exploring other Black craft makers and traditions, but there was just so much there that like we really just wanted to do justice to that story, as opposed to spread ourselves thin and like just do a broader kind of like survey.
Yeah.
And then it ended in an exhibition of work at the Center for Crafts, who was the one who gave us the grant.
Yes, that's what it was. Yeah, it was a grant from Center for Craft. Yeah. Okay. This is a question that was so profound that you had asked Dr. Moman years back that I want to ask you now, after you've had years under your belt and having done this research and written this book. In telling these stories, how do you convey the empowering stories of enslaved craftspeople who were potentially carving out a slice of agency through their craft within these oppressive environments, without minimizing the horrors of their enslaved existence?
Yeah. I mean, I think like, yeah, I think we have such a hard time as a country talking about slavery. Obviously, that's why we're in this shitty place that we're in right now. It all goes back to that. I think we have no way. I think we don't have the tools. We're never given the tools. And we're also given this false whitewash narrative about our history, about who did what, who made what. I think after 2020 and, the summer of 2020 and Black Lives Matter, there's definitely been an expanding of consciousness about the extent to which enslaved labor built the economic foundation of the world, not just America, but the entire modern Western world. But I think what's also still left out is that the technology and the ingenuity and skill was also brought by enslaved Africans, was pioneered by people who were enslaved. I mean, there's one story that I read about recently, actually, about the, are people familiar with the court process, Henry Court? Steel, making steel?
Yeah.
So it was a revolutionary process. It was like what really spurred the Industrial Revolution. And Henry Court, he was a banker. He wasn't a metal worker. And he gets credited with inventing the court process. What did the court process do? It was a way to mass produce really high grade, low carbon, high tensile strength steel, which just means like more malleable, flexible steel that you can use to build railroads and bridges and make wires out of. Because before that, when steel has a high carbon content, is impure, it's very brittle, which is useful for tool making and edge tools. You want carbon steel, right? You want high carbon steel because of edge retention, right? Like when you're woodworking. So, but with low carbon steel, like that, just kind of like a way to mass produce that, which like not to get in the weeds of like that process that was pioneered, but it's kind of like this process called puddling. It's very ingenious. So before that, you take the iron ore and you're smelting it like with the fuel source, and a lot of impurities, not just carbon, but manganese, silicon, phosphorus, all of that gets into the metal and makes it very brittle and makes it not like good iron, good quality iron. So in St. Thomas, Jamaica, enslaved blacksmiths were created what we think of as the court process. And they did it independently. They did it because they had this knowledge and were enslaved because they had this knowledge. And Henry Court was a banker who his brother-in-law told him about what was going on and how they were just like mass producing this super high quality ductile steel that could be used for railroads, that could be used for anything, really high grade stuff. And he came down to Jamaica, shut down the foundry, and patented the process in London. And that process before that, England was like basically had horrible steel, mostly imported steel. And then they went from, like being somebody that needs to source steel from other European countries to the biggest manufacturer of steel and spearheading the Industrial Revolution because of this process that was pioneered by. And it's like that, learning something like that can shift people's conception of the modern world, and like, because I think like what kind of gets left out in how we learn about American history is like, I went to public school in the South. And what I was taught about enslavement was that it was just black bodies tilling the land and picking cotton. That was it. That's it. And I know a lot of y'all learned basically the same thing, and it's just like, it's 2025 and these stories are just now bubbling up. It's crazy to me that like, I went to a plantation for the first time in my life when I was 37 years old with Charlie Riley doing this research. And it's crazy to me that people get married on plantations and they're not Holocaust sites. Right. That's crazy. That says everything you need to know about America. That says everything you need to know about America. And there's so many stories and there's so much about just like the brilliance that Africans brought that were taught things. There was no guidance, and people brought this skill and this know-how. And it was foundational to the modern world, to the technology of the modern world. So
that's one story that you're sharing now. In your book, you talk about metalwork throughout Charleston and New Orleans. That, I mean, anybody who's been in those beautiful towns, you've seen all the ironwork all throughout. What most of us don't know is that the oldest ironworking site dating back to 2000 BCE was recently unearthed in West Central Africa, where the majority of enslaved people were captured, just proving that technology and knowledge was in these bodies before they were.
Oh yeah, totally. Especially metalworking. Like, I think there's more of an acknowledgement of smithing and metallurgy skill in antiquity in West Central Africa. I think like people who study like the history of metalworking and the books that I was reading, it's like they acknowledge like, yes, like this has been going on for thousands of years. And West Africans developed steel and processes for refining steel to make it more usable, kind of like that quartz process, for centuries before Europeans did. And I think Europeans were kind of constrained by convention. And that, again, it just takes like new minds and new ways of doing things for paradigm shifts to happen, and that's kind of what happened. But the thing that's such an injustice is those shifts are credited to people who never touched metal, like Henry Court. Everybody knows it as the Court process.
Mhm.
He didn't know how to work metal. He was a banker, and he failed at banking. And his brother-in-law was like, yo, come check out these dudes in St. Thomas, Jamaica, man. They're doing some crazy stuff. I think we can kind of like jack it and patent it and like be rich. And that's what they did, So, yeah, I mean, I just think that like that erasure is so foundational to why things are still the way they are. And why the status quo is still what it is in America. I mean, it's like America runs on erasure,
There's the slogan.
America runs on Duncan and erasure.
We just had a Western bootmaker here a month ago who shared a story about downtown Lynn, where I live. It was at one point the shoe capital of the world, and we talked about a Black craftsman who developed the lasting machine. I can't think of his name right now. Thank you. Yes, Metzger. He's celebrated in Lynn, but never got, obviously was, the idea was snatched, but he like, I can't share the number. I don't remember the numbers, but he developed the lasting machine that sped up the entire process and made it global.
Yeah.
That's good, has this work researching the histories of enslaved Black craftspeople been emotionally taxing on you as a Black craftsperson and scholar?
Yeah, absolutely. It can be. I mean, I think it's taxing as well as it is like liberating in a way to know how people just like survived and made art no matter what, I do think that like, I mean, like, yeah, I think the art and the craft, it speaks volumes. It's also an archive in a way, like, and I think that's part of the book too. Like what I'm hoping to kind of like say in the book is that craft can be an archive, especially for people who make things. You can kind of read the language of objects, and decisions that people make in order to make things a lot of times are informed by access to materials and conditions of their lives and things like that. And it tells such a rich story, so I think like objects should be used to kind of uncover a lot of histories. They really can be. And that people were always making art. People always knew that like they were doing dope stuff, like Gee's Bend. I have a whole chapter on the quilts of Gee's Bend, which is just like America's original abstract art form. They were developing a sophisticated abstract visual language just for themselves and their community. The pedagogical process of how they even learned how to quilt was a very sink or swim, you have to find your own voice kind of way, which is how we teach art now. It's not like this like rote sort of like, here's a pattern, you do it. It's just was embedded with improvisation, which is like a modality that shows up in Black art and crafts throughout the diaspora, which I try to bring to furniture. And I thought green woodworking is the place where I can bring improvisation, So I don't like to sketch, early on I sketch stuff, but like when I make things, especially like the back slats where I do those carvings, I cut through the back slats of the chairs and I carve things in them. I like to leave that open, and I'm using found objects now. And so much of that is inspired by this idea of improvisation, of using found objects and of really, having no boundaries in terms of like what you're trying to say and what you're trying to use and things like that. And I think Black folks have been doing that in their crafts just because they didn't have access to the same materials, but also because like they developed a language and a style out of that limited access, and that's such a amazing tradition that I want to carry forward or bring to furniture or something.
Right. I'm glad you brought up Gee's Bend, because something that stood out to me in your book in that chapter is how they were discovered by pure happenstance after a 1965 visit by a pastor who was there to, and Gee's Bend, if you've looked at it geographically, it's very isolated. It's surrounded by a body of water. And they were visited by a pastor in 1965 who was there to interview local residents who had faced retaliation for registering to vote.
Mhm.
That's how these quilts were discovered, which that is incredible to me.
Yeah. No, it is incredible. Going back, I'm just realizing I didn't answer your question about like the kind of like emotionally taxing aspect of like doing this research. I think part of what gives me solace or hope or whatever you want to call it is that like we're still oppressed. Not just Black people. We're all, I mean, like look at our country right now. Like it's
Not good.
It's not good. It's like everybody is slowly getting more and more oppressed. Like, and people are just like all out with it. You know what I mean? Like just I mean, it's like you got to call it what it is, you know? And I think that like here were people who we need to take lessons from the enslaved, you know, as opposed to being afraid of looking. I want to know, like, the older I get, it's like, how did they live? Like, you know,
How did they survive?
How did they
through
survive?
this?
Have joy, birthdays, marriages, all of these things happened, you know, and like, and still they were in this system. But also it was a very, depending on where you were, like Spanish Florida before America got there, New Orleans before America got there was a very different place. There was still enslavement, but the task labor system, which was the same thing in Charleston as it was in Spanish Florida, allowed people to make crafts, to cultivate their own gardens that they could sell at market, that they could even sell to the person that owned them and their plantation. And it was a very, that you could hunt, you could own guns as an enslaved person. So when I think about that, I'm just kind of like, wow, this is a really nuanced kind of oppression. And I feel like we live in a very nuanced kind of oppression. It's part digital, it's part IRL. You know what I mean? Like seriously, like, and it's this weird kind of like, I think like the digital world that we're living in now is doing something weird to our consciousness we don't even know about. We are guinea pigs, but it's not going anywhere. It's just going to continue to develop. And I feel like I'm just trying to take notes and lessons from how people still lived very rich lives and made incredible objects under oppression that we couldn't even imagine.
Right.
Yeah.
You said it about yard shows, the ultimate metaphor for the survival and resistance of a people to a dominant culture that has for so long discarded Black life. Yard shows, this work of art, testament to humanity's relentless urge to create art and find beauty under any circumstance. That's what we learn from.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
A question about you've done, okay, well, two other questions. And this is the time when I would invite other people to gather your questions for Robell, as well as our virtual guests. Go ahead and start asking the questions in the chat. So you referenced 2020, Black Lives Matter, George Floyd's murder, when just sort of everything exploded. That's actually when Dr. Momin founded Black Craftspeople Digital Archive in 2019.
Yeah. Right.
And so, and then you've had all this research, you know, you have this book, like there's been this increased interest and importance put on this work. Is it still maintaining, or have we lost steam with this? Where are we now?
Yeah.
We're into, it's 2025.
Yeah,
There was
hard.
an explosion of interest in this important
Yeah.
material.
It's
5 years
difficult.
ago.
I mean, that's almost like asking, like, what do I think the political landscape is? And I think it's like, I don't think anybody knows. I think we're in a weird time, you know, and I think like it could go any which way, you know, and I think everybody's filled with that anxiety, not knowing which way it's going to go. I know I am. You know, and I'm medicating in the ways I need to in order to survive, you know what I mean? I'm really just keeping it real. So, yeah, so I think like, yeah, it's a really weird time. I think that we kind of live in like 2, 3, or 4 different countries. Sometimes it feels like, you know, and I definitely don't have the answers. And you know, I think that, I mean, there's a part of me that always resents that like we only talk about this during Black History Month.
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah.
I know how to play the game, and I know like that's what you have to do. But also like I resent the fact that Black history is siloed to the shortest month of the year.
Yes.
Agree. But also at the same time, it's still such a necessary intervention. That's what it was. That's what it continues to be. You know, like we're in the era of book bans. That's happening now. You know, they're banning African American history from high schools. They're pulling books about Rosa Parks, about the civil rights movement from high schools. So you want to talk about erasure like that's so present. It's still here. So there's a part of me that's like, Black History Month is still necessary, though I still resent it.
Yes.
And those two things can be true. And we can also hold those two feelings like, oh, this is important and we need to do this, but also like this. Like, why is it always that I get the, you know what I mean? Like, you know, you listen to me talk, and then the rest of the year, that's it. You don't have to think about it. You know, you don't have to think about these stories, and you don't have to think about how it impacts our conception in the popular imagination of what we think of who's entitled to what. You know what I mean? So, yeah, so I think it's, you know, we'll see.
Sorry, that was
Sorry to leave you on that.
No, there's one more question I have, and then we're opening the floor up to everyone. You've done, congratulations on this and the press.
Thank you.
You've done some really awesome press
Thanks.
recently around this. What's a question that no one's asked you that you wish someone would ask you about this? Sorry, that's also a surprise question, but
Yeah.
but it's kind of seated in like, you know, what is your intent? That's also a
Yeah.
good question.
Yeah.
Just what's something you wish someone had asked you about?
About the book.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I feel like it's all in the book. You know, like you know, I put a lot of energy into like trying to make it something that people can draw things out of, and that, you know, like it can inspire your own practice or your understanding of like the world, our country, and things like that. Because I do think these stories matter. You know, I think part of like how it relates to like furniture making in a way. Maybe this is a question that I wish people would ask me is like, and Charlie and I talk about this a lot, is like, you know, damn, I got to be really careful because you guys learn
We
period
can edit
furniture.
this.
Yeah, okay, edit this out. But you guys, I mean, like you guys learn period furniture, you know, and period furniture is something that most people, Black and white, did not live with. It's not the material culture of everyday people, period. You know, so it's like, why are we exalting the furniture of the 0.01%? You know, like the Jeff Bezos of 1700. Like I want to look at, like I'm trying to look at his ball and clawfoot chest. Like, no, man, I want to know what people in Appalachia were making, Black and white and indigenous. You know, like that's why the ladderback chair to me really symbolizes America more than a Windsor chair, more than a Chippendale chair. You know, more than Empire style, more than neoclassical, like all of that stuff. Which, by the way, more often than not, was made by enslaved people or indentured people, white as well. You know, so it's like, and just like the court process, people like, you know, Robert Walker, you know, super well-known neoclassical furniture maker from Charleston. He's in all the decorative arts museums, you know, enslaved lots of people, still gets credited with all of his work. Do we know if he made anything? Who knows? You know, but at least be honest in your labels and how you like label these things, that we don't know who made this stuff, you know? So I think it's like, there's a part of me that hopes you get from this, like, you know, these are the stories of the people that we need to be identifying as like our history. You know what I mean? Working people, people who were indentured, people who were enslaved, people who were, you know, just everyday folks. They didn't live with ball and clawfoot anything. You know what I mean? So yeah, not to like, I'm over here taking shots at like, you guys are like, no shade, no shade, no shade. I'm just saying that stuff is like, you know, I think it's like that stuff really matters, you know, like what, you know, like what we're choosing. I think museums tell a curated history, as they should, but it's just like, why are we curating the history of like the landed, wealthy, enslaving people? Well, why are we curating that as our history, and we're presenting it as like, this is America's history? I think part of it is because who started these places? Who started colonial Williamsburg? You know, the Rockefellers. Who started Winterthur? The DuPonts. You know, so it makes sense. You know, it makes sense that they're embedding these myths, you know what I mean? And then a lot of people walk in there and they think that this is the furniture that I identify with, like the solitary white cabinet maker busting out these crazy pieces. And that couldn't be further from the truth. That's not it. That's not how it worked. So anyway, I'm done ranting.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Does anyone have questions for Robell? Yes.
You kind of spoke on this earlier, but I think for a lot of us that are in school now, we're trying to understand how we compete with like, I don't know, with like musicians, it's AI, everyone's talking about AI, like coming in and just ruining it for musicians. And I feel like I'm in jewelry, so I deal with seeing like drop sites online and like people who aren't interested in buying fine jewelry anymore.
Yeah.
And I'm very nervous about leaving here and sort of once you leave school and you're out in the world and you're trying to make stuff, how do you wrestle with that, I guess?
Yeah.
Like I'm in sort of your vein where I'm 33 and
Yeah.
I came here and I'm like, well, this is it.
Yeah.
This is what I'm gonna do.
Yeah.
And I'm just so scared.
Yeah.
It's like after this cushion that we have.
Mhm.
So I know you said like it's 2025 and kind of get ready, but do you have any advice for people who are just kind of
Yeah,
like,
just starting out.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's hard. I mean, it's just like, I just think it's getting harder to survive and live, just like and like find a place to live, never mind like own a place. And like that's supposed to be like the pinnacle of like being a fully formed adult person is like ownership. It shouldn't be that way, you know, like not to interject too much of my personal political beliefs, but like, yeah, that shit is a human right. We don't have human rights in this country. We never have. And we're gaslight into thinking that like us fighting and scrapping to like get food and housing is like the way things should be. It's crazy and it's getting crazier. So I think like it's hard. Like I feel like for me, like I kind of lucked out because like I make weird one-off chairs and people started buying them, you know? And I think like for me, it was again, like it was kind of always this thing that was a hobby that I really enjoyed, but like I had other work to make money, you know? And like this in a way is like something to give me a little bit of agency and breathing room from the chair thing in case like people are like, we don't like your funky chairs anymore. What's that?
Should I read a book?
No, but also this was a nightmare too, because like I dropped out of college. Like I didn't like writing essays. I wanted to work with my hands. So, you know, this was definitely, but I think like it was a great challenge. And it was something that like I was up for the challenge, and it was something that I felt like would expand my practice and thinking. And I was already like, I read and I'm like interested in these things. And the opportunity just kind of like fell in my lap, really. Like I felt like I was called to do it. Like, you know, I'm a very hokey spiritual person. So like when I got that email, I was like I gotta say yes. And like this is a sign, you know. But yeah, it's hard. I mean, I feel like here's the thing, social media also too, like I wouldn't be here without social media at all, you know. I wouldn't, you know, and I think social media is a gift and a curse. It's a total psychic drain for me. You know, like it can really break my concentration in the shop and I hate it. But also at the same time, like all the opportunities I've gotten for work and like publicity and things like that have come through like putting myself out there on social media and like showing my process and like because I don't have the normal CV when I, you know, like when I started teaching at different craft schools, they could see my work and they could see my reels and like how I make things. So that in a way is like, you can kind of circumvent the normal, you know, institutional way to get what you know, like through social media, you know, it's just, yeah. I mean, I feel like, you know, I don't know. It's just hard. I feel like, yeah, you got to find your thing, you know, but I don't envy. Yeah. And for me too, like I have a partner, I'm married, I have a kid, I have a life and a family, and having that income from my wife is the only way I could be here. Yeah. Like I'm not going to obscure that. Yeah. There's no way. Like, I'm not going to sit here and be like, yo, I'm self-made, man. You know what I'm saying? Like I'm the bud, pick myself up from my bootstraps. Like, you know, like that's a lie, you know? And I think I do feel like a lot of furniture makers like to project that image, but that's all cap, man. I see your
Just
shop.
across all different fields projecting that image, you know.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So
We
it's
can't
like,
do what we do without our you know.
Yeah, having some kind of
the other
support, having like,
constraint.
yeah, having a wife that like got health insurance for us and our baby and was like believed enough too. Like even before I believed in myself and she was just like, you got this. Like, I know you can make this happen. Like, you know, and like that meant everything, you know, but I would still be making furniture and I was headed towards like just being the contractor, you know, which is what I was doing beforehand.
A question from a virtual guest. How do you see the future of Black craft evolving, and what do you hope readers will take away from your book?
Yeah, I think one thing I think too is like people are doing really cool craft work that isn't what we think of as traditional craft. You know, I follow a lot of nail techs on Instagram, and I
So
think
good.
incredible. I feel like, and we need to see that as craft. People who braid hair, people who do things like that is a legitimate craft. We don't need to wait 150 years to be like, oh, I think what people were doing with nails and hair was pretty dope back in the day. You know, I mean, I think it's like, it's cool now and it's a total craft and people are pushing the boundaries and doing really cool things. So I hope people can like, be able to see things that are craft. People are doing really cool stuff with shoes. You know, I follow a lot of people who are like taking Air Force Ones and doing crazy mixed media stuff with it. Yeah, all kinds of things. So I just think like, I hope people can see that craft is everywhere and that we're humans and we're naturally going to do dope stuff with materials and like, don't just like have blinders on and be like, oh, if it's not wood, clay, textiles, glass, it's not craft. So,
Yeah.
I'm not grant preservation and carpentry student, and I'm curious. This feels insanely white, like most white thing I've ever been a part of in my life.
yeah.
And I'm curious, do you have any advice on finding like other BIPOC people in this space, even though like I want to be a timber printer and then like was a thing and then died and now it's coming back.
Yeah.
But it's still the field that's started or continued to be surrounded by white people.
Yeah.
Do you have any advice on how to like find more people of color? And how to not like be sad that it isn't.
Yeah. No, that's a good question. I mean, I think like, you know, again, the internet age is great for finding people doing stuff in all locations of the world and country. But also too, like, I think part of it for me is like, I supplement what I don't get from woodworking with just like the community that I choose, you know? And I think for me, like, I try not to place too much of like my like identity and friend group and stuff into like what I do.
Yeah.
You know, I think there's so much more to people than what we do. I do feel like we do live in a world where your profession and your earning potential kind of defines you, and we kind of internalize that and like let that define ourselves in a way. But I do think like it is hard though. You want to see yourself represented. It was super discouraging for me when I started out, which is why like, you know, I tried to find these stories because, you know, these stories kind of became my colleagues or my contemporaries in a way. And I wanted to be in conversation with them and their work and things like that. But yeah, I mean, I think just, and I think too, like the longer you do stuff too, like you find those people.
We're going to take more questions here, but I'm going to end the virtual side of things because we don't have any questions from this group. So let's tie this off. Virtual guests, thank you so much for being with us. You can reach out to Robell if you have other questions. And if you want to buy the book, just follow him or let me know. And thanks for being with us. And we're going to close out the virtual session. Thank you so much.